Hello, everybody. I'm David Hamilton. I'm an antitrust litigation partner at DLA Piper in the Baltimore office. This is our antitrust podcast, where we focus on, obviously, antitrust issues and subtopics associated with pricing. This month, we're going to be talking about pricing and antitrust issues in the airlines industry, and we have an all-star panel to talk about these issues. I'm going to introduce them all, talk about the topics a little bit, and then they're going to say a little bit more about themselves. I'm first going to introduce you to Bob Kneisley. Bob was introduced to me by a mutual friend who refers to him as Battling Bob Kneisley. He's had a career in representing airlines in-house and in private practice, and was in-house at Southwest Airlines and has some stories to share, I'm sure. I am also going to introduce you to Dr. Nicholas Hill, an economist at the consulting and economics firm Bates White. Dr. Hill formerly was an economist both at the Justice Department and at the FTC, and most relevant to our conversation today was an expert witness in the JetBlue Spirit merger case. And I'm also going to introduce you to Dr. Kerry Tan, who's an economist at Loyola University. Dr. Tan has done a lot of work in the hubbing and dehubbing area as it affected by or does affect prices. So we're going to get to the JetBlue Spirit case toward the end, but we're going to talk a little bit about the history of how we got to where we are, including the history of airline mergers, get some stories from Bob about the early days and the challenges of representing Southwest as it was the challenger, the disruptor, the maverick at the time that it began its history. I'm going to move to Kerry on the hubbing and dehubbing issues and also talk about merger analysis generally and maybe some specifics of what happened in the JetBlue Spirit case. And then at the end, we'll do a little bit of predicting about maybe what we see happening in the newly announced Alaska Airlines Hawaii merger. So with that, let me introduce you all again. Bob, could you introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure, David, thanks. I've spent about, over 40 years in the airline industry, and that encompasses a lot of antitrust issues. I was in private practice representing air carriers, airports, investors. In an airline practice firm, I spent over 20 years as a lawyer for Southwest Airlines in the Washington, D.C. office, and had a great deal of interaction with the federal government, particularly with the Department of Justice. I was involved in a couple of mergers that Southwest undertook, and on top of that, we had a large number of other antitrust issues with other carrier mergers and asset acquisitions and the like. So I have a pretty good idea from a practitioner's standpoint of some of the issues that we're going to talk about today.
Nicholas?
Sure. I'm Nicholas Hill. I'm a partner at Bates White. I've worked on antitrust issues in government at the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission. I've worked on them in private practice, as I do now. I've had a lot of experience on airline mergers, so I've testified on one, the JetBlue Spirit matter. I've worked on others, and I've worked on non-litigated airline matters as well. So I'm pretty familiar with antitrust issues and how they apply to the airlines industry.
And Kerry?
So I'm Kerry Tan. I am an associate professor of economics at Loyola University, Maryland, but that will be soon changing as I've been promoted to full professor effective in July. So I'm excited about that. I've long been interested in the airline industry. My PhD dissertation was on airline pricing strategies, and I've evolved my interest. Still studying the airline industry, but now taking a look more at on-time performance.
That's great. And we're going to start with the question. Why does it seem that the airlines industry is the most unloved of all industries? Let's go. Bob, you take it.
Well, okay, yeah, I've got some thoughts and maybe a theory. And that is a lot of it has to do with how the federal government treats its airlines. When you think about it, I have never heard the Secretary of Transportation say a complimentary word about the airline industry, which is pretty stunning given the fact that the airlines are a pillar of the U.S. economy, accounting for something like 10% of the nation's GDP, and it carries about 1 billion passengers per year safely to their destination. But on the contrary, the DOT, which has regulatory authority over the airlines, seems to always be talking about things that are wrong with the industry, things they've done wrong, things individual airlines have done wrong. If you go to the DOT website, it's filled with descriptions of violations and penalties and remedies for violations committed by the airlines. That is clearly the focus, in the name of, by the way, consumer protection, which in the abstract sounds like a noble goal. The problem is there seems to be no balance. And the DOT itself has been on a tear recently, coming up with new regulations. The most recent, you may have heard, has to do with refunds, what the DOT is calling immediate cash refunds for significant delays or cancellations. And again, in the abstract, that sounds, I guess, reasonable. The problem is airlines already have a process for compensating and taking care of their passengers, and no airline will succeed if they don't in the case of delays. And beyond that, the rule makes airlines the insurer or guarantor against weather delays because the required refunds kick in for any reason, including weather, which airlines have zero control over, or air traffic control delays, which, after all, is the province of government. So I think that's highly questionable. And then, on top of all of that, this is about to get worse because the DOT just announced an MOU with 25 state attorneys general to help investigate and determine violations of some sort against consumers all around the country. The problem with this is that federal law prohibits and preempts state consumer protection laws against airlines. So this is a backdoor effort by the DOT to get state attorneys general offices involved in determining whether airlines have violated federal law, which they are actually preempted from getting involved in. So that's highly questionable, and it's the first time I've ever seen undermining the bedrock principle of federal preemption of state law. That's my rant for the moment.
I think Bob brings up a great point when he talks about delays and cancellations. Every time I poll my students how frequent are flight delays and airline flight cancellations, they always overestimate the incidence of these events. So I think people fall victim to the availability bias, thinking that these events are happening more than they actually are, because whenever there is some massive amounts of cancellations happening, you get a lot of news stories that go out there saying airline so-and-so is melting down, sometimes for good reasons and sometimes not to the airline's fault.
Yeah, so two thoughts on that. One, I've heard in another context that humans really dislike impeded locomotion. If someone stops us from getting somewhere we want to go, it's very annoying, and that's one explanation for road rage. So I think that's part of it with the delays. Then on the delays in general, I think it's also true that a secondary effect of those is when there is some kind of delay, some sort of catastrophic situation, and it's hard to recover from those, even if you're a very well-managed, very well-run organization. So often the post-delay issues make things even more aggravating, even though it's very hard as a practical matter to be prepared for a gigantic snowstorm that shuts down a lot of your flights at once.
Yeah, just to round this out, Bob and I had a discussion recently about how many experts there are in the airlines industry. There's 435 sitting in the House and 100 sitting in the Senate. Every passenger is an expert and has a list of complaints and a list of suggestions about how to deal with things. The idea that we've made travel by air accessible to almost everybody has its downsides too, for sure. So how do we get where we are? Part of it has been because airlines have had a pretty good history and level of activity on the merger front, particularly in the 2000 to 2010 period, when now what we call the Big Four market share, the Big Four being Delta, United, American, and what originally was a low-cost carrier, Southwest. But the Big Four market share went from about 15% to 80% by the time the decade ended in 2010. And by way of example, during that time period, American acquired TWA, US Air, and Amwest. We also had pretty explosive growth in the what are called the LCCs, the low-cost carriers. Low-cost carriers now may have their own competition, as we'll get to in Nicholas's JetBlue Spirit testimony about ultra low-cost carriers and what disruptive effect that they had. But let me just toss this to the group. When you look at, if you're in the government or if you're a consumer welfare proponent and you look at the market concentration and the market structure, what do you see are the concerns that might be expressed in the consumer's terms? Pricing, higher prices, reduced quality.
Yeah, the usual list of concerns would be higher fares or fees, less service, so discontinuation of service you liked and wished would continue, and lower quality service, so cutting back on snacks and things like that that you might otherwise wish to have on the flight.
Yeah. And there's always been this concern about the smaller number of competitors lends itself to a greater potential for collusion on pricing issues, right? And all of you have done some work on that area. Kerry, you had a paper a couple years ago on the presence of Southwest Airlines and its anti-collusive effect on the industry. Can you talk about that a little bit?
So in economics, we study something called multi-market contact. Normally, the more rivals on a route, the better, or the stronger the competition and therefore lower prices. However, sometimes if those rivals are competing head-to-head in multiple markets, then what may happen is that could lend a greater incentive to tacitly collude. So what I found, along with two co-authors at the University of Oklahoma, was that the more intertwined the route network between rival airlines, the higher the prices are. And we saw that this phenomenon existed for all routes except for when Southwest exists on that route. So when Southwest competes against the other big three, we see that the other big three compete honestly. And when you take Southwest out of the equation, that's when there appears to be some empirical evidence of potential tacit collusion or higher prices.
So, Bob, you and I talked about when you were at Southwest, there were allegations. And many years ago, I think the statute of limitations has expired on price signaling and things like that. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. I would like to respond a little bit to where you started off and what Nicholas said. I think in spite of some of the very predictable criticisms of consolidation in the industry, what is sometimes missing from that is the advantages to consumers from larger route networks in terms of being able to have more robust route systems, hubs perhaps working more efficiently. I have seen economic analysis, I don't know if you guys have, that demonstrate that after all the mergers, there actually are higher average number of competitors per city pair. This is all across the country than prior. And that may have to do with the efficiencies that have come from larger route networks. So I think it's not quite so simple, although I've dealt with consumer groups that just have this knee-jerk reaction that because there are only a few major competitors or 4 airlines having 80% market share, they must be colluding or prices are higher. As far as collusion goes, I think your paper is excellent, Kerry. And I also saw that, I believe I'm right, is that you looked at other low-cost competitors, and I think you found that they did not have the same anti-collusive effect that Southwest had. And my understanding of that was because their route size or their market size was smaller, and they could be more easily ignored by the larger carriers that were tacitly colluding.
That's right. So one way that you could take a look at the results is why Southwest? So what we wanted to do was say that Southwest had a unique position or a unique role in the industry. So what we took a look at is, do other low-cost carriers, do they create a similar effect, what we called an anti-collusive effect, on this idea of tacit collusion happening? And the answer is no, that for some reason, Southwest is special. Southwest is unique in the U.S. airline industry in its ability to strike down this type of behavior.
So a couple of thoughts on that. I mean, we did a lot of work on this, obviously, in the JetBlue Spirit context, and so did the other side's economists. And I think there was broad agreement from both groups that Both Spirit and JetBlue had a very significant impact on legacy fares when they enter a route. You see clear and distinguishable falls in fares, and in general, they were either similar or larger than Southwest's effect. So I think there's been a significant, maybe the newer generation of LCCs and ULCCs are having a very significant effect on price. I'd also just say, stepping back a little bit, I mean, there was a time when most of the carriers were hub and spoke carriers. And one of the things about hubs is that if you have a couple of airlines that are hubbing, unless they hub at the same place, they'll have relatively few nonstop overlap interactions. If I hub in Washington and you hub in New York, the only route we're likely to overlap on nonstop is Washington to New York, because everything else we're going to try to fly as a connection. So that hub and spoke system had a built-in feature where there wasn't a lot of nonstop competition, and there was competition on connect, but the connect routes were relatively differentiated. So intentionally or not, and I don't think it was intentional. I think the original goal of hubbing was we can save money by doing this, by funneling traffic. It had an insulation from competition effect. And then Southwest popped up and said, we're going to fly direct nonstop between a lot of places, and we're not going to have traditional hubs. And that put a good deal of pressure on the hub carriers. And now others have said, well, we're going to do the same. And JetBlue came along and did it. And then the ULCCs came and said, we are going to do it really cheap and really low amenities. You can buy them a la carte if you like, but we're going nonstop to point. So there's this interesting situation now where you have these hub carriers competing with these point-to-point carriers, and they're very different animals and seem to have different effects. One other thing I would just note is, I don't think the Department of Justice would necessarily agree with this, but one thing that we concluded was that there is a hierarchy in the sense that a JetBlue or a Southwest puts a little more pressure on a legacy airline because the service quality is more similar, whereas the lower down ULCCs are offering significantly lower prices, but maybe a lower quality experience compared to the other tiers. So they put less price pressure on. And that's also an interesting dynamic. Like as you move away, you may be able to offer lower and lower prices, but you may have less impact on the legacies who still fly something like 75 to 80% of passengers if you count Southwest.
I knew it was going to take us about 3 minutes to draw a direct line to the JetBlue Spirit matter. It's kind of the poster child for talking about airlines and pricing and so forth, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But I want to stick to pricing for a minute. Let me go back to Bob at Southwest, and we want to define some terms and define whether there are legitimate uses of practices. And Kerry, I want to come back to you on first paper that I read of yours on dehubbing and hubbing networks both. But Bob, the concept of surge pricing and dynamic pricing has yet another issue or another set of issues received a lot of attention recently. Can you talk about that practice and what it means from the airline's perspective?
I'm probably not the person to address that, but as long as you ask me a question about airline pricing, I have a story involving Herb and Southwest, and that is when Southwest started its original three cities, which were the triangle of Dallas, Houston, San Antonio. Now, that was all intra-state, intra-Texas. Southwest was, of course, a new airline, and originally they started with a $20 fare. Every seat, $20. Now, that greatly exploded the market. Lots of passengers. The problem is it wasn't profitable for Southwest. So what Southwest did, they figured out that there were some passengers who valued lots of flights during the day, other passengers who valued low fares. So they started the first two-tier pricing strategy where they called it executive during the day and pleasure at night after 7 p.m. And they raised the executive fares to $26 from $20, and they reduced the pleasure fares to $13. So what happened was Southwest made a lot more money because the business travelers were happy to pay the $26 because most of them were on expense accounts anyway. And the $13 off-peak fare was very, very popular with the leisure traveler. I think that might have been the first or one of the first ways of segmenting market demand. Of course, this is very sophisticated now. And just on top of that, if you don't know, you might have heard that Braniff, one of the incumbent carriers at the time, started a fare sale that every seat was going to be $13. And the problem with that was that Southwest would have been bankrupted if it had to match those fares. So what Southwest did very creatively is they gave all their passengers a choice. You can pay the $13 fare, or you can pay a $26 fare. And if you pay the $26 fare, you get your seat and a fifth of Chivas Regal or Crown Royal or Smirnoff. And what happened was most of the passengers opted for the $26 fare. All the business passengers were on expense accounts. So they got the seat and they took home the fifth of Chivas. And this is no lie. Southwest became the biggest distributor of alcohol for a couple of months in Texas. And after a while, Braniff gave up. It lost a lot of money, and it lost the passengers too. So it shows you some of the creativity that happened back in those early days.
I mean, that's a wonderful story and shows you how Herb Kelleher was a genius in competition. And I'll even go back on the history a little bit. The idea that Herb was able to create intrastate routes was a novel idea. He was able to avoid the Civil Aeronautics Board because they had jurisdiction over interstate routes. So Herb avoided the regulatory effect of the CAB by just starting with intrastate routes. Amazing. Kerry, let's talk about hubbing, dehubbing. Why don't you tell people what that really means so that I think we on this podcast all understand the concepts and maybe even more. But from an airline standpoint, as it affects a customer or an airport standpoint, what is hubbing and dehubbing?
Well, Nick talked about hubbing earlier, trying to funnel passengers through a central location. And I did my graduate work at Ohio State, and just down the road was Cincinnati, and Cincinnati became dehubbed by Delta. So the idea is that Delta reduced that centrality out of Cincinnati, particularly once they acquired the Detroit hub in the Delta Northwest merger. So what we get is that an airline ceases hub operations at an airport. Now, what I did at first was to take a look at pricing at these dehubbed airports. And what my co-author and I found was that surely when there's dehubbing, you're going to have a reduction in supply of flights. And therefore, economic theory would predict that prices should go up. And that's indeed what happened when no one picked up the slack after the airline dehubbed the airport, because naturally you're going to have a lot less flight operations at that dehubbed airport. Now, in some cases, that dehubbed airport saw an increase in service by a low-cost carrier. So in instances where a low-cost carrier swooped in and picked up some of the slack from the dehubbed airline, that's when airfares actually decreased. We saw an increase in airfares when there's no low-cost carrier presence, and a decrease in airfares when there was a low-cost carrier that came in, kind of saved the day there. Then what I did was I took a look at how dehubbing affect on-time performance. So in a separate paper, what we saw was that surely, again, with a reduction in hub operations, that meant that there was going to be less nonstop destinations for the local passengers flying out of that dehubbed airport. But we called that paper a silver lining because what we saw was after dehubbing occurred, there was an improvement in on-time performance in the sense that there were less flight delays. The analogy that I like to use is that, let's suppose you're driving on the freeway. If there's less cars on the freeway, you're more likely to get to your destination a little bit quicker. There's not as much traffic and not as much road rage as Nick mentioned earlier. So now at these dehubbed airports with less flights going in and out of the airport, there's less congestion and therefore an improvement in on-time performance. Now, is that a big win for dehubbed airports? Certainly not. Because if I'm a passenger flying out of an airport that's dehubbed, I'm missing that presence from that hub airline. But again, we called it a silver lining because despite the reduction in service, you at least got to your destination more likely on time.
That's great. Really interesting stuff. And for those that are listening, I hope you pick up one or two of Kerry's papers and read about this. We could spend a lot of time on the JetBlue Spirit case, probably another 2 or 3 podcasts if we wanted to. I'm going to go formally to Dr. Hill as the economist expert witness, and I'm going to set the stage for you in 2 ways. I'm going to ask you the everyman question. Okay, so you got the big 4, and then you have 2 ultra low-cost carriers, JetBlue and Spirit, who announced publicly that they are combining so that they can compete and reduce prices and provide better services and compete against the big four. What's wrong with that from the everyman standpoint? And I know that economists and antitrust lawyers look at it slightly differently, but I think that's an overall question that most people would want to know the answer to. And then we're going to play antitrust nerd stuff, and I'm going to read you a quote from the Philadelphia Bank decision in which Justice Brennan said, "The test of a competitive market is not only whether small competitors flourish, but also whether consumers are well served." Assuming that is good law, and I think it is, do you feel like that was the outcome in the JetBlue Spirit case? Dr. Hill.
Yeah, let me start with the everyman question. So that was the thesis, and we tested it. Essentially, the idea was that JetBlue, by offering a higher quality service with on average higher fares than Spirit, put more pressure on the legacy carriers. It looked more like them, but it had lower costs, so they tended to react more strongly to it. And by purchasing the Spirit planes, and the plan was to extensively retrofit them so they would be JetBlue planes, more legroom, more spacing, more amenities in flight, and then it would compete in a broader area with the big four who carry the majority of the passengers. So that was the thesis. We felt our economic work supported that. DOJ didn't necessarily agree. I believe the court eventually endorsed that idea, that the transaction might bring more competition and benefit people who fly on legacy carriers. The court's first objection, which you could put in the everyman box, was, well, there are people who like to fly on Spirit. They like the ULCC model. They like the a la carte model. They're not going to get it post-merger because, well, JetBlue is a LCC with some fares that are similar to ULCCs. It's not exactly the same thing. And for the court, that seemed to be one of the central issues, that you're taking away a brand people like through this merger, and that in of itself is problematic. A second concern you could have is, suppose everything I've said is true, that the merged airline is going to compete more effectively with the legacies. If it's the case that the two merging firms compete a lot with each other today, and that competition goes away, that could harm customers who are flying on them today compared to the world where they don't merge. The DOJ also made that argument. My reading, at least, of the decision was that the key point was the first one.
Yeah, I think there was a line in Judge Young's decision that said something like, "All you customers and fans of Spirit Airline, this one's for you."
Yeah.
Right.
And he had something about it's but a small airline, which apparently, I'm told, is a reference to a Supreme Court case involving Dartmouth, where it's but a small college, but there are those who love it, from like the 1800s or something like that. So I think that was missed. I certainly didn't pick it up until someone pointed out to me, but it was this general idea that a merger that removes consumer choice in that way, the court found was reducing competition.
Okay, go ahead, Bob.
Oh, I just was going to say, I have some sympathy for Nicholas in this, because I think the problem that you guys faced was the statute. I mean, you were litigating this case under the Clayton Act, Section 7, which governs mergers. And the problem is that the statute itself reads that if the combination produces any line of commerce in any section of the country which substantially lessens competition, the transaction is unlawful. And I think the way I read the judge's decision was he gave you credit for what you just said you were proving about the efficiencies and benefits of the combination. But then he came back and said, the problem is you've removed competition from the ULCC, from the Spirit end, by retrofitting the planes, taking the seats out, de-densifying them or whatever. And I think he felt he was constrained by the statute. And he basically admitted it's a difficult standard, because he essentially said that you can have all kinds of benefits, but if you diminish competition in one relevant market or more, it violates the Clayton Act. And a federal judge is not under any obligation to do a kind of a weighing of what is it on the net. At least in my experience, I think that kind of weighing one relevant market against benefits, one loss of competition against benefits and efficiencies, that's something you can argue with the DOJ in private and try to convince them not to bring a case as a matter of prosecutorial discretion. I think the problem was DOJ said, well, we're going to sue anyway. and you guys were stuck with a statute that's very difficult to meet. That was my takeaway.
Yeah, it's a great point, and it struck me because one of the things I thought about during the case was, suppose this was a pharmaceutical merger, and I told you, look, prices are going to go up on acne medication for teenagers. On the other hand, the efficiencies are going to cure cancer. And I think everyone would say, okay, well, probably I'm in favor of that deal. That seems like a good deal. But as you say, the law is the law. It doesn't say you should determine which of these you think is societally more valuable. And that was the way the court read it and decided, I don't have to do this balancing.
So we know from our listening audience that they like for us to make predictions and tell them what we see around the corner. We didn't even get to talk about the Northeast Alliance. We know about the JetBlue Spirit case, but in the recent past, Hawaii and Alaska have announced a merger. Kerry?
So I think if you asked me a couple of years ago, I would not have been so fearful of the imminent success of an Alaska-Hawaiian tie-up. But given what's happened with JetBlue Spirit, that's really changed my view of how the DOJ has been pursuing these merger cases. So when I take a look back on particularly the American-US Airways merger, and in that particular case, the overlapping network was the biggest concern, I take a look at Alaska and Hawaii, and the overlap in that particular case is not so strong. So normally I would think that this could be an interesting tie-up and potential very highly likely tie-up. But now I'm not so sure.
Nicholas?
I'm going to give an answer so boring you won't believe it, which is that what I've learned in antitrust is if you don't know the facts closely, because it is very fact specific, it's really hard to make a prediction. The only prediction I can make about that case is I will be following it with great attention, and I'm really interested to see what happens.
Bob?
I think that the DOJ is going to take a very close look at two large markets. One is the mainland to Hawaii market, which itself encompasses many different gateways on the mainland, to see what the market shares are going to be between a merged Hawaiian and Alaska. And they're also going to look at the intra-Hawaii markets, island to island. I suspect the more important market is the mainland to Hawaii. And even there, I don't know enough about, obviously I haven't done enough flying to Hawaii to know what the market shares would look like. But I mean, more importantly, whether there are any barriers to entry. If in fact the market share is increased in like Seattle, let's say, but if you can fly out of Portland and elsewhere and other carriers can come in, does the DOJ care? On first glance, it looks like the kind of merger even this DOJ might allow, but I'm not so naive to think that they won't give it a very hard look.
And I'll just finish this off by saying, for me, it's as much about the court and the judge as anything else. And you look at the JetBlue Spirit case, and another judge might have said, well, I understand the attraction to Spirit, but all things considered has pro-competitive benefits, and the merger of JetBlue and Spirit acts as a constraint on the other four, and I'm going to approve it. So who knows? And that's maybe being a bit too obvious, but I think the court and the judge are important if the DOJ decides to challenge it. So this has been a fantastic panel. We could keep going forever, and we may want to come back and revisit this in a year, see how all our predictions and our discussions went. But I want to thank all of you, Nicholas, Kerry, and Bob, for participating on behalf of DLA Piper and on behalf of our audience. So thanks again. That's a wrap.
Thank you for listening to DLA Piper's Pricing Rules podcast. All information, content, and materials contained in this podcast are for general informational purposes only. This podcast is intended to be a general overview of the subjects discussed and does not create a lawyer-client relationship. Statements and opinions are those of the individual speakers and participants and do not necessarily reflect the policies or opinions of DLA Piper, LLP US. The information contained in this podcast is not and should not be used as a substitute for legal advice. No listener should act or refrain from acting with respect to any particular legal matter on the basis of this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel in the relevant jurisdiction. This podcast may qualify as lawyer advertising, requiring notice in some jurisdictions. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. DLA Piper, LLP US accepts no responsibility for any actions taken or not taken as a result of this podcast.